And welcome back, everyone. I'm Anatoliy Gruzd, professor here at Toronto Metropolitan University and director of research at the Social Media Lab. I will be moderating the panel on disinformation and misinformation during the Russia's war in Ukraine. Ukraine has been long a target of disinformation campaigns by the Kremlin, and they use various different strategies, information warfare tactics, essentially to discredit and undermine the work of the Ukrainian government. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, we see Russia deployed an army of bots, trolls, and other proxies, essentially, across various social media platforms to create more favorable, we can say, information environment for their agenda in Ukraine. To help us understand the Kremlin's information warfare strategies, and also to understand what policymakers, social media platforms, as well as individuals can do to detect and fight disinformation campaigns, we've assembled an excellent panel of experts who have been thinking about these issues even before the full-scale Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened earlier this year. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Tatiana Locka, she's an associate professor in digital media and society at the School of Communications in Dublin City University. Tatiana researches threats to digital rights, internet freedom, and internet governance in Eastern Europe. She is also the author of a recently published book called Beyond the Protest Beyond the Protest Square, Digital Media and Augmented Dissent. Next, we have Maria Giovanni Sessa. She's a senior researcher at the EU DisinfoLab. EU DisinfoLab is an independent European Union-focused NGO whose stated goal is to raise awareness on disinformation and contribute to a better information landscape. Maria's research interests focus on disinformation and political communications, primarily, gender-based attacks, as well as international crises. And we also have among our panelists, Larissa Doroshenko, who is a visiting lecturer of communication studies at Northeastern University. Larissa's computational research projects focus on the dark side of social media use. And these are concepts and topics such as nationalism, populism, and disinformation campaigns. Dear colleagues, I really was following your work for a number of years now, and I'm so delighted and thrilled that you are here with us today. Let's open the panel with each of you giving a 5 minutes opening remarks to situate your body of work within this larger area of research. And after opening remarks, I have a couple of questions to each of you. And then we're going to open up the panel, the Q&A section to the audience. All right, if everybody is ready, Tatiana, I would like to invite you to go first with your welcome remarks.
Thank you, Anatoly, and thank you for everyone who's joining our panel. It's a real pleasure to be here, despite the circumstances, which are obviously horrific. I may be based at Dublin City University, but I'm actually joining this online panel from Kiev, Ukraine. So if you hear any air raid alarms, that's on my side. You know, I think this is really a good opportunity for us to talk about what is happening with disinformation and misinformation, because obviously there's lots of online events and in-person events that are connected to the war and to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I do think, as Anatoly pointed out, it's really important to note this war and Russia's interventions in Ukraine have been going on for 8 years, if not more. And so lots of the tools and ideas and problems that we will be discussing today are not new. They've been around for years. As we know, Russia has been expanding its arsenal in terms of information warfare and disinformation, but also Ukraine and other countries have also been, crystallizing their own efforts all this time. So really, for me, what's changed based on my own observations what's happening in the hybrid media space is the intensity, that's my cat, by the way, the intensity of propaganda and the intensity of disinformation and the intensity of the counter efforts as well, right? Obviously, on the military arena, things have become a lot more intense, and the implications have been really grave. But also on the propaganda front, I think propaganda has become more brazen. Propaganda has become a lot more prolific, but so have the counter efforts. And in my work, what I really prefer to focus on, and what I've been focusing on, is the grassroots citizen responses to disinformation and to various information threats, because I think it's a really important part that often gets lost in these grand narratives, of geopolitics and information orders and trying to redraw the map of the world. I think the efforts of citizens are really, really interesting, and they really warrant a lot more attention than they've been given. For me, the war is very much a participatory war, which we know extends opportunities for participating in conflicts. And we've seen extended opportunities for citizens through mediated means as well, right? So people have been a lot more online, people have been a lot more on social media. And it's not just citizens, it's also governments and military actors, media outlets. Everybody has been spending a lot more time online and in social media. But Ukrainian citizens in particular, I think, have made excellent use of those horizontal networks that have been built since the start of Ukraine's independence, and through the various political transformations, not least of them the Euromaidan protest in 2014, and then the ensuing occupation of Crimea and eastern regions. So really, they have used those horizontal networks to build coalitions, to build movements, to build organizations, and a lot of these organizations remain very vital to the effort today. And a lot of those organizations, both in terms of, for instance, open source investigation or news fact checking and debunking, they remain central to what's going on today as well. So really, people have mobilized away from or alongside centralized authority, which I think is really important and really interesting. I will say that citizens have relied on a range of platforms where disinformation is spread, but also where disinformation is countered. And alongside the usual sort of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we've also seen a lot of activity, both in terms of disinformation distribution and counteracting disinformation on more closed platforms such as Telegram, WhatsApp, Viber, and other messengers, but also on newer platforms like TikTok, which, they've become kind of home for a variety of different genres as well. And Telegram for me has been really interesting, especially because it's a series of locked chambers, and sometimes those chambers are semi-open because we're talking about public channels, and sometimes they're locked because these are private groups which people join and they need to be approved. So very often we don't even know what kind of disinformation is being spread unless we're able to join the group, and that obviously makes the work of researchers like us very, very difficult. But it's also really important to understand that these are very different environments. They're not like public groups on Facebook or public accounts on Instagram, and that the disinformation is spread in very different ways. They're very often relying on personal connections and trust that people build. And in the same way, that's how people vet information, right? It's not only based on the content of the information, but it's also based on who is spreading information and how do we know if we can trust that person. Debunking, as we know, is really important, but I think for me, pre-bunking, so not just countering disinformation, but preempting disinformation and not reacting to it, but being proactive, for me has also been really, really key in the events since the end of February 2022. We've seen a lot of initiatives where Ukrainians seek to fill the information space, lest there be a vacuum that can be filled with disinformation. They seek to fill those spaces with factual information, but also, historical threads, providing context on the war, on the events preceding it, and even engaging in what I call corrective action, which is, in addition to, of course, collective and connective action, also corrective action, right? So people are having in real time debates about language and the role of language in the conflict, territory, historical roots of the conflict, claims about the role of NATO and the EU. All of these things are being debated in real time, and people are also issuing correctives. So they're saying, don't call it a Ukraine crisis, it's Russia's war in Ukraine, and things like that, right? So we're seeing a lot of this proactive activity on social media among citizens, but also, of course, open source intelligence helps again, and also really important. It's not just about factual information and evidence, it's also about personal storytelling, emotional testimonies, because guess what, this war is really traumatic. A lot of people have lost their loved ones, they've lost their homes, they've lost everything they had. So really sharing emotional stories and testimonies of your experience during the war has also become a really important tool for people to counter disinformation, which a lot of disinformation tends to discount, people's experiences. And for me, also really interesting to note the role of Twitter as a kind of niche tool for citizen diplomacy, because it is a really niche platform in Ukraine, but it is a very key platform for Western actors, for journalists, for politicians, for media figures. And Ukrainians are using that platform specifically to talk to these people and to bring their messages there, right? So they have Twitter threads full of messages for Western audiences. They also have Twitter live spaces, some of which are in Ukrainian and sometimes in English again, where they share information and host various experts, Ukrainian experts, I might note. So to me, really, this sort of sums up some of my initial impressions, and I'm sure both Maria and Larissa will add, based on their experiences, what they're seeing. But I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much, Anatoliy.
Thank you, Tatiana, and I hope you and your family are safe in Kiev. And once again, thank you for joining us today. Now over to Maria. Tell us about your work and where you come in from research-wise to address these issues.
Of course, thank you, Anatoliy, and I would like also to thank the whole organizers of this conference of Social Media and Society, the audience for being here, and also my fellow panelists, starting from Tanya for this interesting introduction on which I can only agree. So regarding my research, I think that probably the reason that I'm here today is for my latest work on narrative evolution, and what I have done together with my colleagues is to draw and analyze on the similarities between COVID-19 and Ukraine-related disinformation. And of course, I think that all the people in the audience here are very much familiar with the idea that disinformation mirrors the infosphere. So if a big event happens in society, disinformation will exploit it, and that it is also somehow circular. So it also revives narratives that are especially polarizing for the public and audience dividing, because that's the kind of things that disinformation thrives on. So basically, I'm not going to make considerations about the narratives, although we found very similar ones from clickbait stories, both of victims of the war and of COVID, from denialism of the pandemic and of the war itself. So regardless of what are the type of crisis that we're speaking about and the motives and the type of dialectic and rhetoric that we have behind it, what I have started to think lately, and probably this is the political scientist in me speaking, is that disinformation really exploits the anti-establishment sentiment. And so disinformation really speaks to those that political scientist Hans-Peter Crazy defined the losers of globalization, those people who feel threatened by the new order of things, by multiculturalism, by economic interconnectedness. And in this case, it is very easy to weaponize whatever crisis, because the virus is the epitome of an interconnected world without borders, where we cannot control something that starts in China and ends up to involve the rest of the world, because the war in Ukraine, and in this regard, standing with Russia, is a form to assess an alternative to Western ideals and to multicultural values. So something that is more rooted in conservatism and in Christian values and all the things that we are familiar with. But I could go on. Electoral fraud. We've seen so many narratives regarding electoral fraud from the US to France to Germany. The DisinfoLab has written extensively about it. It's proof of the failure of democratic institutions. So whatever the angle, we're always speaking at the malaise of this very hybrid category, because it's something that really associates well with whatever left or right ideology, cultural background, and yeah, so, and especially regarding the war in Ukraine, I think that this has been particularly successful because Russia has been very good throughout the years, and my colleagues know it better than I do, probably, for sure. I'm kind of a newbie to this topic, especially since the invasion of Crimea in 2014, where the European Union started to be very strict with Russia. So Russia has started looking around at allies and found good allies in the European far right. And it has conducted an extensive cultural diplomacy strategy in order to be able to portray a tolerant image of Russia and subsequently of the invasion. This is why, very simply, in very simplistic terms, we have entire communities that have switched in a couple of months from being sworn anti-vaxxers to dropping COVID altogether and focusing on pro-Russia narratives. And yeah, so the last thing that I'm going to say for this warm up is that given this picture, and I am really, I don't mean to make everyone's Monday even worse, but the next crisis is right around the corner. So whatever it will be, another election, another virus, another war, well, disinformation is going to exploit and to pry on these topics. And I do really agree with what Tanya has said about pre-bunking disinformation. This is something that we should aspire at. This means that we're mostly working on an a posteriori threat. We are responding to a crisis, but we should aspire to move away in the field of countering disinformation from a crisis management type of approach to a more systematic community building type of approach. And this is something that I speak from a European perspective. I do believe that European institutions have the means and power and resources to do. And right now it is crucial that as an international community together, we start working also not just on responding on the Russian disinformation against Ukraine, but also on building a strong counter narrative. And I will give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the similarities and differences between COVID-19 related and Ukraine related disinformation and misinformation campaigns during our Q&A section. And now over to Larissa.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for organizing all of this. It's a pleasure to join two of my colleagues. So where I'm coming from is like basically just my curiosity and interest in all of the various political processes happening in Ukraine for, I don't know, last decade and a half, really, and looking at how social media in particular, how digital media are enabling this civil democratic movements in the country. And by doing that, throughout my PhD training, I gravitated toward looking at how political actors, such as like political movements or political parties or specific candidates, were using digital media to mobilize their voters, their constituencies. And that inevitably, especially after Euromaidan, led into the interest of how far-right parties were using this social media, along with other political parties during the presidential and then European elections. Then Zelensky campaign, very creative, came along, and very interesting how, you know, there were like things that people were skeptical about, and rightly so, but there was also the very masterful use of social media that mobilized a lot of young citizens. And we see some of the ripple effects these days as well. And essentially, it also starting working on the disinformation campaign, we got a hand on internet research agency tweets when I was finishing my PhD, and a lot of students or members of the group naturally gravitated towards studying disinformation campaigns in the United States, because that was the hot topic at the day, post 2016. And I was just like, no, wait, guys. I mean, we see so much activity going on in like Arab language about Syria. We see these hashtags. We also see a lot of interesting Russian language tweets about Ukraine. These campaigns have not just started in 2016, so there's more history to it. And that would lead to the project of looking specifically to the Internet Research Agency strategies during active, like really phase, the start of the war in 2014. And the more active phase in Donbass at that time. So we took a snapshot of that year and looked at the strategies used back then. And so essentially, the way that I think, I'm very grateful to be in this panel, and I gladly accept all of the invitations, is because I think it's so important to amplify the expertise of people who actually have the, more or less extensive background knowledge in the area, because we see a lot of people who just jump on the topic and they study, let's say, disinformation in the United States, and they just think it works the same way without knowing the context and intricacies of this region of Ukraine in particular. And so kind of like raising awareness, raising expertise of me and my colleagues, and then also, in a sense, what I'm doing is like exploring these nefarious mechanisms, right? So like before we maybe can rebuff them or preempt them, we also need to understand what they are or what the strategies are. And one of the big revelations that stem from that project, studying disinformation campaigns in 2014 in Ukraine, but also I was part of the collaboration of studying that in the United States in 2016. What we found is that these strategies were not just simply spreading false information or like fake news, as we call it these days, but rather some opinions, right? Certain takes on the current events at that time, which were very hard to verify because it's just an opinion, right? But that opinion essentially undermines our beliefs in deliberate democracy, in the way that the government works, in our political systems and democracy in general, or in the traditional fact-checking and traditional media outlets. And so all of that is just like kept informing our understanding of, okay, like we not only just looking for the things that are false, like we can verify and say that they're false, but rather we have to be also aware of other more sneaky strategies that have been employed back in the days and keep recircling now. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A part of it. Essentially it's also these opinions, I think what Maria was talking about, it can be about vaccines, right? And then you shift also to other areas and other topics. It can be about our governments, about political parties, which essentially just used to exacerbate divisions within the country along political lines and create chaos. So we'll see what's going on, but there is a lot like kind of political turmoil, and we see how Russia is really actively supporting some of this fringe parties or some nationalist parties or some mainstream parties. I'm talking about, like, let's say, Hungary, France, or these days also Balkans or Serbia has been some development going on there. So all of this process, we have to be aware and think like who is supporting these narratives, who's spreading them, and be more alert to that in order to actively rebuff that and preempt the strategies.
Thank you, Larissa, for the opening remarks. And by the way, we put a slide up with some of the articles that Larissa referenced, some of the published work in this space. And we're going to send the links out after the panel into the chat room in case you're interested in reading more about Larissa's work and her colleagues. Well, there is certainly lots to unpack, and let's get to it. I have my first question to Tatiana, and so I was wondering whether you feel that both Russia and Ukraine are engaged in similar information warfare tactics, and if yes, are there differences, and maybe is it appropriate or relevant to ask who's winning in that space? Over to you, Tatiana.
Thank you. That's a question. It's actually a question that is asked quite often in panels, because everybody wants to know, is it the same kind of information warfare? I'd say just as on the real, well, physical battlefield, Russia and Ukraine are doing two different things. I think the same is happening in the information space. Russia's tactics, as I said, we haven't necessarily seen anything especially new. As Larissa mentioned, it's not just sharing straight up fake news. It's very often trying to seed doubt, so sharing multiple narratives, slightly different ones. And even when something specific happens, like some sort of attack or some sort of attack that targets a civilian object, for instance, or a city center, it's really typical for Russia to seed multiple narratives, providing different explanations for what happened. Those also tend to change over time, for instance, so first they'll say, oh, we didn't, it wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians. Then, 2 hours later, they'll say, oh, no, it was us, but there was a reason, why we attacked this particular place, is because it had some sort of military object there. And then they will change it 10 more times. But guess what? I mean, this strategy is not new. Just yesterday, there was the sad 8th anniversary of the downing of the MH17 flight. And I mean, the same story, multiple interpretations of what happened. Back in 2014, Russian channels first said, oh, we shot down a Ukrainian military airplane. And then when it turned out it was a civilian airplane, they changed their story, and they kept changing their story, and they're still changing their story. So I think that very much, that kind of idea that it's not just to share fake news, but it is to seed doubt, and it is to make the target audience doubt everyone, including Russian media sources, but also other media sources, Ukrainian media sources and official sources, Western sources. That's kind of really the main strategy. And, that's done by not just state channels, but also all of these smaller grassroots propaganda channels of various, some of them we don't even know who is behind them. I think on the Ukrainian side, there's been a slightly different strategy. First of all, there is a really clear kind of strategy of relying on official information and actually preferring to share less information rather than sharing too much, and trying to, as much as possible, verify it with official sources. And I think that's been really helpful, because it sort of counteracts this attempts to seed doubt by saying, look, we're sourcing our information, here's where it comes from, here's who said this. And even within the Ukrainian information space, there's been a bit of like disciplining going on, because some people do tend to share unverified information or post things too quickly, and then they get rebuked by other Ukrainians for it. But then, as I said, alongside this, there's also this acceptance that we don't just need facts, we need lived experiences. And I think that for me has been the second most important kind of piece of foundation that I've seen in how Ukrainians do. You might call it information warfare, or you might call it information defense, whatever you want to call it, but they're saying, look, it's not just about sharing hard facts and numbers and figures. Figures are indicative. It's a war, it's an active situation, but it's people's lived experiences, what people really went through, how they feel, and what this has done to their lives, that has been really, really central. And it's been really good to see that some of these stories have been picked up by mainstream media, which I think is also really important, because those are the stories that need to be shared. So that would be my 5 cents in response to your question.
Thank you, Tatiana. I just found it fascinating to think about these concepts as, what's the difference between information defense, information operation, and information warfare. Is that something also you get asked a lot about, or is it still developing concepts, would you say?
Yeah, I think what we call it probably matters less than just like knowing what we're talking about and what the salient differences are. I think I recall somebody in another panel I was in that was about the war, called it, what Russians are doing is information warfare, what Ukrainians are doing is constructive communication. I'm like, well, that might be going a bit too far, because certainly not all Ukrainian communication on social media is constructive. There's also quite a lot of shit posting, but even shit posting is kind of like, it has its aim in basically like trying not to harm, but instead to do more good. So I think that's the difference, is the effort is to defend the information space and to defend Ukrainian values insofar as they are, and to defend the real history and like the real people, as opposed to just trying to introduce doubt and chaos as the Russians seem to have chosen as their aim.
Thank you, Tatiana. My next question is for Maria, and you mentioned you're building on your work related to COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So reflecting on that work, can you a little bit unpack for us and tell us, maybe give some examples of similarities between different topics, but maybe same strategies? And also, why is it important to consider different topics, but whether they use same or different strategies in general?
Yes, thank you. Well, in fact, I think that the strategies are per se similar, because the goal is the same, which is to polarize, to provoke emotional reactions, whether they are feeling moved for the vulnerable category that is being targeted or showcased, or indignation also for the evil category in this case that is being targeted. So we are definitely seeing a lot of similarities on that side. I think that the most striking basically identical narratives that I have encountered and that really make me, I will not go into that, but one could probably have a panel on its own about the concept of post-truth that era that we live on, and how facts and opinions are somehow, for some weird reason that I'm yet to understand, put on the same level. It is, for instance, denialism. We have seen even graphically very similar cases of denialism. As some of you might have seen the contextualized photos of people, which were, in the case of COVID-19, it was a music video that was being filmed. In case of the pandemic, it was climate activists, and these people were lying on the ground in a desk body bag, but of course they were caught moving, smoking a cigarette, moving their arms, and in this case, these images were months apart, decontextualized, and used to demonstrate, allegedly, of course, that people were not really dying from COVID or as a consequence of the war, but they were actors being paid to play the part. So this idea of absolute relativism, the impossibility not to know the truth, and again also the conspiracy theories that we meet right now. We are all familiar with the unproven theory that COVID-19 is a man-made virus that escaped from a lab in Wuhan, either accidentally or on purpose as a bioweapon. There are many different takes on this story. And similarly, we have seen, I smiled, but there's not much to smile about, the claim that the US would be funding biolaboratories in Ukraine, which was used by Russia as a justification to attack the country. And of course, this is highly ideological, as conspiracy theories are. It is unfalsifiable because I cannot provide evidence of this. And they play on the same fears of insecurity, on distrust toward authorities, the idea that there is this elite that is scheming behind the people's back and so on. And this is also why I believe that conspiracy theories have a lot in common with populism in this over simplification of reality, of this Manichaean division of good versus evil, the good people versus the corrupt elite. And I will say one thing about the unfalsifiability of these theories, which is exactly what has been said before, and the idea that it is very hard to debunk opinions. For instance, I can debunk facts. I can verify something that has been said or not said by someone. But for instance, even claims like we heard in the beginning that Russia felt threatened by the NATO enlargement, and so they attacked Ukraine. How am I supposed to debunk this kind of allegations? And it's also so rooted in the historical perception of the people. It's very complicated, but what also I believe, and I'm no expert on this topic, unfortunately, that is changing is that also Russia is kind of evolving during the months of the conflict, its approach. So from initially even denying the event of the war and denying the attack, or trying to blame Ukrainians for events at Mariupol and so on. I think that at this point, they are not even bothering sometimes to debunk, but they are being so strategic at pushing the idea that simply the truth is not something that we can know, and that the truth is relative because there are alternative facts, because we live in a post-truth era, and I'm so glad that I managed to end this question in circularity.
Maria, can I just ask you a quick follow-up question? I think something you mentioned really struck in my head, and you identifying a group of individuals in different countries, and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing what you said, but essentially these individuals who naturally distrust the authority, they would be more likely to perhaps believe and maybe spread pro-Kremlin's propaganda, disinformation campaigns. So if that's the case, do you see them as, some may say, useful idiots that Kremlin can employ and use to spread their disinformation strategies? Or is it, or more research needs to be done to identify that, in your opinion? And if any other panelists, Tatiana, Larissa, has any insight on that, would love to hear that.
Well, I will be very short also because much of my answer, unfortunately, will be speculation due to my limited knowledge. And the long story short is that I certainly don't know, to the extent that the latest research that I have conducted within the framework of EdmoBelux, which is a European project that we are a part of, as you DisinfoLab, focused on a limited number of communities, which were 225 Telegram channels, public Telegram channels, Dutch speaking, because the project requires us to focus on Belgium and Luxembourg, of course. And we noticed how systematically, through an analysis of the most recurrent keywords used throughout a period of time that went from 2017 to 2022, but of course we were more interested in the last few months. Well, these were conspiracy and far-right groups that exclusively focus on COVID-19 disinformation, and we have seen this switch that I mentioned earlier from these two pro-Russian stances abruptly. And of course, this is just a marginal example. It cannot speak, of course, for the whole general community. So I think that there are many actors involved, many useful idiots, and sometimes even just idiots, not even useful. We have state-oriented actors, and we have regular users who are sympathizers. So it's very complex, but probably, and I hope that the colleagues here who work on coordinated campaigns or information operations will not find what I'm going to say blasphemy, but at some point we don't care, because we need to look at the greater picture of the type of environment that is being created, and then makes it possible for these narratives to travel regardless of the actors who are behind.
Thank you, Maria. So what I'm hearing essentially, Tatiana, you saying that the strategies, going back to the disinformation strategies used by the Kremlin, is very similar to what we observed in 2014. So this narrative change in strategy. And then Maria, you saying there are also very similarity between strategies used by other actors, even in the case of COVID-19 misinformation campaigns. So if general strategies to disseminate this and misinformation are similar, then Larissa, I have a question to you. do you see any differences in tools being utilized by, state-sponsored accounts to spread such disinformation campaigns?
Yes and no. So I think part of the answer, and I think something that we haven't talked about, and kind of building up on Maria's last thoughts, is that we have how do we detect those accounts? So one way, of course, is like conveniently when social media platform identify the links to, let's say, that Internet Research Agency, which doesn't exist officially, or at least in the same structure anymore. And then but at least it gives us a glimpse a little bit of how they were organized. So back in 2014, they tend to amplify each other, because we looked at Twitter data. So we see, for example, accounts that tend to follow each other, or tend to like each other, or tend to retweet each other. There could be some organized effort to artificially amplify certain narratives. Another important thing that we found, and that I think it's not talked about a lot or not being alerted as much, is use of websites that look like news outlets. And with all of this conversation that we had today, we already established that people are not very good at detecting which is which. And second, they're also, if they don't trust traditional media outlets, there's this new media outlet that tells the truth or whatever, it's independent of whoever is other people are dependent, or other media outlets are dependent on, so I'm going to listen to it. And so that just creates this additional reinforcement algorithm, right? Because it's not just the tweet, it's not just a social media post, it's also a website that has much more information, and it also gives the semblance of legitimacy. So in fact, one of the accounts, websites associated with the IRA back in 2014 was refan.ru. You can just get it very easily. It's very popular, it's still on. It doesn't have any social media link handles associated with it anymore, but it has Telegram channel, it has Kontakte page, it has Odnoklassniki page, and all the other popular social media platforms in Russia. And people think that, yeah, it does look like a legitimate federal news agency, and yet we know that its Fury handle was associated with the Internet Research Agency. So there's this kind of Twitter plus websites. And then absolutely what Maria said and Tanya already alluded, Telegram gained popularity, I would say within last 3-4 years in the region, and then people flock more. I think Viber was more popular before, and people gravitated toward this social media platform. There are these channels that you can subscribe to and get your news information. The channels can be associated with legitimate figures, such as news agencies or prominent politicians or other public figures, or they can be also some weird groups that spread disinformation. So one of the channels that I found in the beginning of the war were communities specifically targeting Russian-speaking population in Western countries, and also in Asia, such as China and Southeast Asia. There's a lot of people presence in Bali, Russian language population. There was some for Brussels. There was a group for Poland. So all of the, and it's hard to track them indeed. So I think, again, kind of harking back on what Maria said, we have to be alert what social media platform is popular. But in the end of the day, we also should be just, keep an eye on the strategies, because I think if we keep going after algorithms or social media platforms without thinking about underlining kind of mechanisms or the strategies used by disinformation, we might be just, it's it will be an endless chase, but in this case, it's not going to be as effective. Because disinformation might essentially also even get into the legitimate news outlets or even some opinions of experts. We've seen a lot of talks how Ukraine should surrender part of its territory. It's okay, coming from very reputable and prominent experts in global warfare and geopolitics. And so, in this case, it was okay, yeah, they're not paid by Russia, but we should still consider this part of disinformation, in my opinion.
Thank you, Larissa. You touched on so many interesting points, and I see both Maria and Tatiana have follow-ups. Maria, go ahead. See you first.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on what Larissa said and comment that indeed there are different actors to look out for, and something that we at the DisinfoLab are working on, and my colleague Anna Romero is working on a piece on this right now, is specifically type of actor, which I think are probably the innovative one, the novelty that we should look out for, which we label the Disinformation Entrepreneurs. So these are accounts, and we mostly found them on Twitter and YouTube, that present themselves as outlets that inform about the war according to the format that the platform allows. So more structured videos on YouTube, or the very short, straightforward tweets. They have different goals, and some of them monetize, and they usually asking for donations on behalf of viewers. Some others, we have no really reason to believe that what they're doing is anything but for getting fame, because they are able to get thousands of followers. And this is very interesting, and it also sums up the fact that what makes people follow these outlets is the sense of perceived credibility, the fact that they seem like they have breaking news, that they are covering the topic in an unbiased way when they really aren't. And either some of them profile themselves more as opinion leaders. Some others actually pretend to be media, and they have, even in the visuals and the way that they approach the audience, they could look like media. They could fool some people. And ultimately, I think this goes back to also a matter of credibility, which is something that I have come to reflect, and I don't have a definitive answer during the pandemic, and the fact that much of the disinformation that we believe during the pandemic, and probably not just because, okay, I will just say that we speak about infodemic as this overwhelming amount of genuine and not genuine information, and I believe that this is something that we will have from now on in each content. We are overwhelmed with information, and some it's not genuine, some is, but overall it all contributes to what we call the information disorder. So credibility is ultimately something very, very fragile, very delicate, and yeah, and I was saying that much of the disinformation that we encountered during the COVID-19 pandemic got to the audience because people believed that they were able to rely on the spreader of the message. And I will just say one final thing is that it is also not so easy to distinguish them. Probably it's easier in the case of Ukraine, but in the case of the pandemic, for instance, we had a lot of also medical experts spreading disinformation. And if I say that somebody is credible to speak about medical issues if they have a degree or a PhD, well, look at Luc Montagnier. He won a Nobel Prize, and then he ended up his career sadly spreading disinformation about COVID-19 being caused by or triggered by HIV or that kind of stuff. So again, that's very tricky. Who am I to say to people that he's not credible if he has the credentials? So yeah, that's what I want.
Maria, I think you're raising a number of important points about fact-checking, and I made a note. Hopefully we have time to get back to discuss fact-checking issues and challenges a little bit more, but let's get to Tatiana.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on two things, to pick up on what Larissa said about Telegram, and I think the role of platforms more generally in this ecosystem, and then what Maria said about influencers, and maybe to reflect on how influencers are operating and how they're perceived on the Ukrainian side as well. So, you know, in terms of Telegram, I think it's a particularly interesting case, you know, of a platform positioning itself openly as an actor in the information space, not just as a platform that allows people to exchange messages or share content, but also, you know, a platform that actively makes decisions about how and why information is shared and what information isn't shared and why, and what rules they set. And I think it's really important for us not to forget that we should be very, very attentive to what platforms are doing, also to what they're not doing, how they're reacting to various bits of criticism they've received, because of course they have received criticism. And in some cases like Telegram, I have a paper that I recently co-published with a colleague of mine, Marile Weiermars, where we looked at the role of Telegram in the protests in Belarus, right? Where Telegram on the one hand performed as being this sort of protector of free speech and protector of citizens and digital rights and, on the side of the protesters. But on the other hand, in its actual decisions about what to leave on the platform, it actually allowed both citizen groups and state very much propagandistic disinformation channels to stay on Telegram. And we're seeing the very same thing happening in the Russia-Ukraine war situation, where Telegram is not taking down, say, Ukrainian channels, however partisan they are, but they're also not taking down propaganda channels, be they state supported or kind of these like individual influencers, some of whom have amalgamated huge followings, right? And so Telegram is basically just saying, we believe in free speech for everybody, so we're not disciplining anyone. And we can discuss whether or not that's a viable position, but I think it's really important that we attend to how platforms act and how they act as political actors in these kinds of situations. The other criticism that, for instance, Meta and Facebook have faced is that they've been way too reactive, and then they've kind of done things sloppily and made moderations decisions very sloppily and continue to fail at making good moderation decisions. Twitter has also faced criticism for like a recent wave where a lot of Ukrainian activists and influencers and fundraisers were basically mass reported, and their accounts were suspended, even though they didn't, not all of them necessarily posted anything that violated Twitter rules. So, there's a lot of discussions about platforms' responsibility. And I think, that is a discussion that should remain quite central to our conversations about the information space and disinformation in particular. One remark about influencers, I will say, I think on the Ukrainian side, what people have tried to impress on these kinds of accounts, that do a lot of commentary on the war and what's going on and make all sorts of predictions about how things are going to turn out. They've really tried to impress on people with huge followings on social media that they are incredibly influential. People look to them for not just verified information, but also credible opinions. And so it's very important to preserve that reputation, right? Because what we're seeing on the other side is that there's all kinds of stuff being shared, and whether or not those pro-Russian or Russian influencers are getting paid for it, that's beside the point. But then right on the Ukrainian side, what happens is that anytime an influencer says something that ends up looking suspicious or not credible, or it makes them look untrustworthy, they then face accusations by everybody on the other side that, oh, well, they're exactly the same as our influencers. They're also getting paid for saying things, and they can't be trusted either, and they're not credible. Because obviously we know, that in this system of horizontal networks, influencers actually have huge power, right? Not just in terms of fundraising for humanitarian efforts or for the army, but just genuinely for swaying public opinion and changing the mood in the room, so to speak, right? Which, as we know, can be really, really inspiring sometimes if it's done in the right way, but it can also be incredibly traumatizing for a population in Ukraine that has already gone through so much trauma. So I think it's really, really interesting that there is such spotlight on the role of these social media influencers that come in all sorts of shapes and sizes.
Again, you raised another important point about the role of social media platforms in this. Can we stay on this general topic a little bit? And I want to shift focus to Larissa. And so both you, Larissa, and Tatiana mentioned Telegram as one of the kind of emerging platform for the good and bad information, shall we say, to spread. So Larissa, I know you've been exploring Telegram a little bit from the researcher side. Can you speak a little bit to those of us who are just interested in getting into this type of research with Telegram? What are the challenges should we anticipate? And if you have any, suggestions how to overcome them?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much, Anatoliy. So first of all, I would say that, and look, Tanya also preempted this a little bit with the research in Belarus. So that's what that's another project that I'm working on and finishing right now, is it's possible, like if there are channels that were posted publicly, in a sense that you can join these chats of users that created the chats and made this link publicly available. You can, as a researcher, get information about the users who are part of the chat, which again, in the beginning of all of the protest movement in Belarus, at least, people were openly like sharing this information, or like at least having some personal identification there, which obviously afterwards led to bad consequences for them. So there's this ethical aspect of how much information I can scrape, and there is an API available for Telegram, which allows you to like gather the information about the users in this public open chats. Another thing is the channels. So the channels is where I just subscribe to this, but I do not get a chance to talk, right? I just passively receive information. So it's like a one-way communication. And in these channels, there's absolutely no way to see who are the users, who are the subscribers. And in this case, it's hard for us to tell if there is any organized, let's say, potentially network of people following the specific channels, how these disinformation channels are connected to each other. There's no way to find it out, unfortunately. But the good news is that it's pretty easy to get content on this channel. So if you want to analyze what type of information being shared, you can either do it even in the Telegram app, like Telegram app or Telegram, it's app, either desktop or mobile, and just scrape all of the images, all of the videos, pretty much all the content from the channel, which is really useful. So that's good. Another part is it's also like different. Telegram decides what to use. Channels also decide how much flexibility or like how much like authority they give that piece of information that was posted. Other channels do not have this function. Some channels have also reactions available, such as you can like and create certain different reactions. Some channels do not have that. And that's also something to consider for research purposes if you want to study those reactions. And also time.
Oh.
Yep, and also time period.
Yes.
How do we decide for how long we're going to study the specific channel? I've seen some works coming up already about the disinformation campaigns in Ukraine during the war, but the war is still ongoing. What we studied month or 2 months ago might not be true in 3 months or 4 months from now on, or it may be just a specific episode that was very unique and not going to be representative of the long-term trend. And so in this case, it's also how do we decide it in the moment of which slice of the information to take? And personally, I've just been accumulating tons of data these days. I'm not sure how I'm going to analyze it, but I know it's there if I need it, or once I have a clear idea of how I want to frame it.
Yeah, those are key questions for any projects, but especially when you're studying disinformation campaigns in the moment. And many of the messages, as Larissa mentioned, can also go away and disappear, or channels or accounts. So how do you retroactively go back and study it if you haven't captured that important information? Good points. We have about 15 minutes just to be mindful of time. I would like to invite our audience to ask any questions they might have for our panelists. Just type your question into the chat room. And I have more questions to go through, but I also see Firoza, you have a hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Gruzd. Thank you, panelists. Wonderful, wonderful insights. I'll ask the questions quickly in order. My question to Dr. Tanya is that right now what is happening in Ukraine, it feels like because of the Western support to the Ukraine, sometimes what they do, they valorize one or two or victories of Ukraine. Let's say somebody has shot down a plane or something. But the true cost of Ukrainian lives are lost, economic crisis, those things, it feels, again, I'm not an expert, feels like not shown enough, again, because of the political reason, like which information to prioritize, which information not to prioritize. So in a situation like this, how do global audience would make sense of what's happening in Ukraine, something like reality vertigo? My question to Maria is, you talked about disinformation in European context, particularly the political economy, and you have touched on something very important, which is the attention that in infodemic, how do you process all of that information? Now, it feels like even if we talk about pre-bunking, it feels like the social media platforms have an active interest in keeping the disinformation alive, because that maximizes the user engagement, that generates data. So they will say this on that, but they will not actually do something because that's against the business model, capitalist logic. So in that case, can pre-bunking help? Or in the process of pre-bunking, are we actually generating more data, more money for social media companies? Question to Dr. Larissa is that you talked about how right-wing politics or the nationalists, they're using different social media. In terms of understanding white supremacy or right-wing populism, it seems to me, if I borrow the work of, many Black scholars, particularly studying digital spaces, that the epistemic anxiety that is happening in the global north, let's say all the conspiracy theories like great replacement theory, or the immigrants are coming and taking your job, hiding the economic anxiety, it feels like there is a palpable anxiety among the whites in the global north, and because of their immunity to many things, they can inflict violence and not suffer many consequences. If Black or the indigenous people would do the similar things, they would suffer in a much worse. So how do you actually think that we approach the disinformation problem, understanding the racial element or the epistemic anxiety? And the last question to Dr. Gruzd is that it seems like a lot of the times that the information disorder or disinformation is seen to be a technical problem that can be solved with technical fixes. The social media platforms can do something, but a lot of theorists would argue saying, no, it is actually a socio-technical issue. Particularly the recent book by Philip Howard, The Lie Machine, where he talks about actual astroturf, like people have disinformation entrepreneurs. Like in Poland, you have legacy Facebook account run by people. These are not political bots. They mimic actual human behavior who are spreading disinformation in exchange of money, and the tech platforms can't actually delegitimize them. So in that case, how do we approach the disinformation problem, not as a technical fix and one silver bullet to solve all the problems? Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions. We can start with the last one, and I think you actually answered it, that it is socio-technical problem, and it cannot be just fixed by technology. Technology can put a spotlight on the problem. But let's dive into your other excellent question, starting with Tatiana, and I would please ask our panelists to keep your answer short, up to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, the answer will be very short. I would disagree with you that lack of information, well, first of all, that there is a lack of all the kinds of information you described. And then I would also disagree that it's for purely political reasons. As Larissa just mentioned, the war is still ongoing. So we still don't know what the actual impact will be. We can provide some indicative information, and actually the Ukrainian government and various state agencies have been, and academics as well, have been providing regular updates on, for instance, the destruction of civilian infrastructure and housing, the destruction of, say, roads and railways, the destruction of agricultural facilities, and the stolen grain and various other products. All of that information is being released fairly regularly. The information about casualties, both civilian and military, again, I would disagree. I think it's only partially, we can say that there isn't accurate information that's being provided regularly for political reasons. it's also because, at least for civilian casualties, a lot of the regions which have seen massive casualties, like the south of Ukraine, are occupied by Russia. And therefore, it's really difficult to actually ascertain how many people have died, simply because those regions are not accessible to Ukrainian authorities and they're not accessible to international experts. So the numbers will remain indicative, both for civilian casualties and for military casualties, until there is some sort of resolution to the war, and until we can actually get access to those spaces and count those lives lost or people injured. Until then, I say, like, Ukraine is probably doing a really decent job of trying to tally all the losses, both in terms of lives and in terms of economic implications. But I am nobody's saying they can't do better. Of course they can, and I'm sure they will. But yeah, so I think it's a much more complicated question, and so really the goal here is not to misinform. The goal is to provide information as accurately as possible, but with the caveat that the numbers will always remain indicative. And if the Ukrainian army says we don't want to reveal the numbers of specific numbers of soldiers, well, that's, again, it's because it's a live operational situation, and they're trying to use every available advantage that they can. That's my short answer.
Thank you. Maria, would you like to go next?
Yes, of course. So thank you for the very interesting question. So I took down some notes. So basically you were asking, can pre-bunking help the attention economy that allows platforms to monetize? Well, yes and no. Of course, we have the never-ending ethical question when it comes also to fact-checking of whether by speaking about disinformation, even if it's just to debunk and verify it, we're somehow amplifying it and perpetuating the fact that we speak about it. So at some level, that might be an issue, but I think that it is really worth the risk, because right now, when I said earlier about building a strong also counter narrative, it is something that should contrast this framework of continuous gaslighting and sea lioning and whataboutism and historical revisionism, basically even terminological revisionism that Russia is conducting, appropriating and changing the meaning of words as genocide and Nazism. So we definitely need to do something to contrast this, because ultimately it is about being on sitting on the right side of history, which I believe we are. And you were saying that whether platforms have an interest in giving this information online because it makes them money. Yes, absolutely, 100%. This is not a charity. This is why, and we'll probably not be able to talk about this more, and probably I'm not even the best person to do it, but this is why we need urgently regulation, because it's the only way that by implementing rules and implementing sanctions in case these rules are breached, that we are able to change the path of disinformation. And so I believe that pre-bunking needs also to come in the form of challenging the architectural structure of platforms. And for instance, I'm a little bit more acquainted with the European context and the Digital Services Act, which is a very important toolkit that we're now implementing. So among the many things that it does, and unfortunately that it doesn't, it introduces an obligation for risk assessment on what are the systemic risks embedded in platforms. And again, I think that this is where you start. And I think that this is, realistically speaking, the opportunity that we have to change the conversation around this information.
Excellent points, Maria. Larissa, over to you.
Yeah, very briefly. So I think I only have one question about the racial element in the disinformation. And to that, I would answer, so that white supremacy or these economic anxieties that you mentioned, they're true for the Western Europe, right? And for the Western European nationalist parties. That is not the case really for agenda that was employed by far-right parties after Euromaidan or during Euromaidan. And that's, again, kind of knowing the context, knowing this kind of political history, right, in the country. But regardless of that, I think and I think it also would speak to this like socio-technical fix of disinformation, is that we need to look at the strategies. So race essentially, right, is a construct. We created it. So the same as an idea of a nation. So that's where essentially stems this Nazi propaganda coming from Russia right now and saying that Ukrainians are nationalists. So if you want to speak your language, you're a nationalist. If you want to, proclaim and celebrate your culture and wear this embroidered shorts, of course you're a nationalist. And like that just seems so bizarre if you put it in this perspective. And yet it is not bizarre for a lot of people who sign up and do believe that Ukrainians are nationalists because of these things. And this kind of idea that we have Nazis in Ukraine, it didn't start now. There were sneaks to that, and like kind of talking about Azov battalion as being Nazi and fascist, started way back 8 years ago, and still Filipino also got into Western media narratives that was like widely accepted. And now when Azov was celebrated in Mariupol, the same journalists who wrote that they're Nazis were also saying it was like, oh, free Azov. How? So my answer to that is that all of this, they're all different constructs. We can say, oh, there are immigrants coming to steal your jobs. Oh, there are Black people, they're different and therefore they're dangerous and whatnot. Oh, there are these people who want to celebrate their culture, they're Nazis. It's all about knowing your audience, knowing the political context around it, and tailoring your message to create these others. And these others can be Black people, immigrants, or Ukrainians. So it's just, yeah, we can't really fix it, but we need to understand how this mechanism works psychologically to then preempt them, debunk them, or otherwise do this information defense operations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Larissa. And I think we have time for just one quick question. And I know Maria signaled to me that she has to run to catch a train. So maybe we can start with Maria. I have a general question for everyone. Those who are listening to us right now, social media and disinformation researchers who are interested, might be getting started with research in the intersection of Russia's war in Ukraine and disinformation campaigns, what your advice would be, regardless whether they're Ukrainian or not? Maria, would you like to go ahead first? And I know you have to run soon.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for that. Well, I don't know. I didn't have quite time to think about it, but something that I recommend, and it's
and I think we lost Maria. Tanya, maybe you're gonna go next, and if Maria comes back, we will loop her back.
Okay, I can try briefly. My advice would be, no matter what kind of social media research you want to do, also please read up on the context in which you're doing the research, read the history, read the politics, read the culture, understand the space, understand the language, understand that what your preconceived notions of something might be may not necessarily align with what you're researching. And also don't discount doing qualitative research. Combining small-scale qualitative, ethnographic research, close reading with big data yields really, really interesting results.
And Larissa, what's your take?
Hi.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, like what can we do? And I think part of it, and I think I alluded already in my previous answer, is that look for strategies. The context would change, but if you want to understand this information and counterfeit it better, think about who these narratives might help. So I was like preparing for this conference on Friday, and I was just started looking because I saw some narratives of how these days, now that Ukraine is getting more of this serious arms, we have this very interesting conversation how out of a sudden we remembered that Ukraine had corruption issue before the war. Now we're going to talk about how this arms might end up in the black market. Let's develop that narrative. And to me, that was like, okay, that really stinks. Like, I think we know we can kind of infer where this narratives might be coming from. And I think all journalists were like, take this angle, they should think, I don't know, 4 times. So like, why now? Why we're talking about these days right now in this position in the war and not in the beginning of the war when these decisions were made. why before we were talking about how Ukraine shouldn't be armed and how this is like a small scale conflict we shouldn't be worried about because it's not, because it's trivial. So this type of narratives, like the context would change, but the strategy or the underlying mechanism, think about who these narratives benefit. Do they benefit Ukrainians or do they benefit Russians? And I think if you, in this perspective, it might be easier to detect those disinformation campaigns.
Thank you for this advice, Larissa. And we have Maria back. Over to you, Maria.
Yes, I'm sorry, unstable connection. I wasn't expecting
You
that.
have the last word for the panel. No worries, go ahead.
What can I say? Be curious about the context, also the historical context, and the fact that disinformation really recycle narratives, that fake news is old news, and that what we have seen for COVID-19, we have seen to a lesser extent, of course, because times were a bit different, for Ebola, for H1N1, for the swine flu. What we're seeing now around Ukraine are also narratives that have been used already against Georgia in the past, as the one on biolabs, or in the Crimean context. So put everything in perspective and don't be fooled by the thing that, you know, we are facing very specific times, because we are, but we can also learn from the past. And I think that's it. And probably pay attention to intersectionality. I think that the beautiful aspect about social sciences is that they all communicate together. So communication studies, social studies, journalism, they can all speak to each other, and they all enrich one another.
Thank you, Maria, Larissa, Tatiana. Thank you for joining us. The audience, stay around. We're going to take a 15-minute break. And after that, there's a tutorial on how to study WeChat. And, you know, based on this panel discussion, I think we should be organizing in the near future tutorial on how to study Telegram. Once again, thank you very much. If we didn't get to your questions for the panelists in time, please post them to Twitter, email them directly to the authors, to the panelists. I'm sure they would love to engage with you. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.